Joe talks about Joe. And now, your host, Joe Slepsky.
Well, hello again, everybody, and welcome back to Joe on Joe. It's me, your host, Joe Slepsky, and this week we are back for part 2 of the thrilling adventure from the Action Force Annual 1998, Night Fighting Part 2. New listeners, if this is your first time here on the show, actually go back last week, because that was part 1. But this is the podcast where we've covered all the G.I. Joe cartoons, a ton of the G.I. Joe comic books, still plenty to go. We haven't covered all the cartoons. There's still some more modern cartoons we need to do. But we did all the classics. We did it all through Extreme. It's the home of Frost Destro, Cold Slither Behind the Rock. It's the home of G.I. Columbo. And it's my home. So it's a warm home for talking G.I. Joe and talking the classic stuff. And like I said, we're getting into part 2 this week. So part 1, we covered kind of what the annual was. This week, before we jump into it, first of all, before we jump into anything, I want to thank our sponsors, the Movies and a Meal podcast. In the beginning of time, the smallest organism gained sentience and thought to itself, I really need a good meal. Then, a bunch of other stuff happened, and finally the Lumiere brothers started showing movies in France. This was all the inspiration that fellow broadcasters Brad, Keith, and Ben needed to combine these two primal needs into the Movies and a Meal podcast. The Movies and a Meal is one of the most casual and relaxing film talk podcasts you could ever listen to. These three friends enjoy a good meal together while talking all about the movies. And not just reviews. They do favorite lists, comparison discussions, genre talks, anything and everything that you can think of. They've even broken their solemn promise inherent in the name and branched out into TV talk. So I love the variety of films they bring to the table. They cover new releases, classics, cult films, often in one episode. It's really a delight to listen to, and it has something for every movie fan out there to enjoy. So if you're looking to grow your podcast library, if you eat meals, and if you've ever seen a movie, then you should give Ben, Keith, and Brad a listen and subscribe to the Movies and a Meal podcast. They've been a great sponsor to this show. I love the Movies and a Meal podcast, and I'd like all of you to love them too. They're the best, and so I want everyone to go online, give them a follow, give them a listen, give them a subscribe. And while you're on there, please do the same for me at Joe on Joe Pod on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can send me an email to joeonjoepod@gmail.com. You can check out our Patreon page at patreon.com/joeonjoepod. Help keep the show afloat that way. And so last week I was curious as I read the story. There was a character in it called Trent. I had it in my head. Raymond Trent. And because the way he was played in the story, I was like, this is a character that existed before. So I did a little searching. Okay, I Googled it, which probably I should have done last week. But point is, I did it for you this week. And sure enough, Raymond Trent, if that sounded unfamiliar to many of you, he was a major supporting character in the G.I. Joe Action Force continuity. He basically was their Ministry of Defense liaison, and for a time in overall command of the Action Force. This story itself, I guess, is the first time that they used his full name, or gave his full name, of that being Raymond Trent. And he had a bunch of adventures. His Joepedia or GIJoefandom.com page breaks all that stuff down for you. But spoiler alert, he eventually gets murdered by Monkey Wrench. In Flint was his buddy, and Flint was offered Trent's job, but he eventually turns it down, feeling he could better honor Trent's memory in the field. So Monkey Wrench murders this guy eventually. That's really kind of neat. I'm going to say that. Not that murdering's neat, but you know what I mean. I like to see consequences in comic books and stories, so that's fun. Anyway, so without any further ado, we're going to jump right into it. I hope you enjoyed last week. Again, go back, listen to it if you haven't. And if you have and don't want to hear part 2, then please feel free to join us again next week. Night Fighting, Part 2. Story. by Steve Allen, illustrations by Kev Hopgood, and color by Steve White. So it starts again with the description of Flint's physical state. If you recall, he's in the virtual reality simulator, while Destro had just revealed himself as the mastermind behind like this technology, and he's getting his revenge on Flint. So, Flint, heart rate 160 beats per minute, blood pressure 180/20, respiration 120 per minute, time 10:46 p.m. There was no chance. The moldering jaws of a disused railway tunnel framed Flint as he stood sentinel over the lifeless form of infantry trooper Footloose, late of Action Force. Flint watched in trance-like detachment as a squadron of Fang helicopters hovered and whined and clattered about his head. He could hear the low grinding hum as 7 20mm grenade launchers powered for release. He could see the silver face of his executioner fluttering like a death's head moth in the starless night. The Fangs were there for one reason only, and that was to kill him. Flint knew there was no chance, and so he threw the grenade anyway. Dead, of course. Were it possible for an immobile silver visor to sneer, decided Raymond Trent, Destro's expression would be a Lulu. Even with his arms pinioned to his sides, even as the less than tender mercies of Footloose and Lady J, Destro's mocking regal appearance dominated the room. Trent seized him by the collar, as much to reestablish the status quo as for any other reason. So it wasn't enough that you steal the Morpheus program. You had to kill Laszlo Norval in the bargain. You're really something, Destro. Praise indeed from the morally immaculate Ministry of Defense. Destro's eyes flashed beneath his mask, transforming his head into an obscene jack-o'-lantern. However, a device such as Morpheus is far too valuable to be entrusted to a mere scientist. Wouldn't you agree? Slivers of the tattered Norval mask clung to Trent's fingers as he released Destro. Exasperation, anger, and mounting fear warring for control on his face. Behind them, on the Simcom couch, Flint cried out in terrible pain, muscles bunching in violent cramps, skin the color of tallow. Destro, said Lady J with deceptive warmth, screwing the muzzle of her M16 into the side of his helmet. How'd you like to spend the remaining 2 seconds of your worthless life wearing that fright mask inside out? Destro was perfectly still. State your demands. Lady J unleashed her very best winning smile. I want you to program an extra element into the simulation. Flint is now at 180 beats per minute. His blood pressure is 190/142. His respiration is 132 per minute. Time is 11:08. Flint took the doorway in a soundless roll, Winchester cocked as he sprang nimbly to his feet. But the farmhouse kitchen was empty. Gutted, a lush moss carpet suggesting that it had been so for some time. Slamming the door, Flint fell against the far wall, his breathing labored. Flint allowed himself a tiny smile. Against all odds, the splinter grenade had detonated in mid-air, sending the Fangs down in a fireball of slewing blades and exploding fuel tanks. Fresh in his mind was the burning vision of Destro, catapulted into the air from the lead copter. Where he had landed was as uncertain as it was irrelevant. Destro could not possibly have survived. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom of the farmhouse, Flint busied himself in collecting the lumps of scattered wood, littering the floor of the temporary home. Odd familiarity tugged at him as he flicked his lighter, attempting to coax the damp shards into life. Had he not taken shelter in a ruined farmhouse once before? He coughed in the thick, peaty smoke. It had been in Flanders, on maneuvers. A farmhouse almost like... no, exactly like this one. The staccato cough of a walkie-talkie rocked Flint from his thoughts, blank disbelief contorting his features as he snatched it from his breast pocket. His pulse raced. There was no room for doubt. He had left the radio where he dropped it, in the abandoned railway tunnel, by the body of his old friend and comrade Footloose. Yet here it was, LED display twinkling like myriad beads of eyes in the darkness. Flint here. Do you copy? Over. To Flint, his voice held all the authority of a snared rabbit. Flint, about time. I hope I interrupted your dream at the best part. Over. For a second time, the tiniest flicker of a smile touched Flint's lips. It was the voice of Lady J. Well, you ought to know, Jay. What's the matter? Missing me? Over. Ha! You are still dreaming. Hold your position. I'm coming to get you out. Wait, Jay. Some of the craziest things have been happening. I killed Destro. And get this. He's Laszlo Norval. I don't... But the line was already dead, the LED display in darkness. Flint's face became taut and grim. With the minutes as air chilled, the battle sound ebbed, and the meager light of his fire dimmed beneath the nocturnal veil. Flint waited an indeterminate time, his eyelids becoming heavy as the stillness deepened. As he dozed, he dreamt that he was dreaming, a dizzying and vaguely unpleasant sensation which snapped him instantly awake as something caught his eye. The briefest flash of polished metal flitted past the open window. All fatigue was instantly dispelled as Flint felt his hackles rise. Someone was prowling about outside the farmhouse. Soundlessly, he unholstered his Winchester, lowering himself to the mossy stone floor. The dying embers of his fire flared again, spreading an almost cozy glow over the derelict shell of the room as a knock sounded at the door. "Flint, it's me, Lady J. You gonna let me in or what?" That's my new Lady J voice. You're welcome. They ate the rations in close and companionable silence, Flint trying not to notice how the golden glow of the fire dappled her face. He swallowed hard, not wanting to spoil the moment, knowing that he must. Jay, Footloose is dead. Lady J watched him for several moments without speaking. "Oh, I know," she said at last. "What?" Flint frowned. Every time he looked at her face, it seemed subtly different, as if it were an image on the surface of water and not flesh he was seeing. "Well, how can you possibly know? No one else was there." Lady J smiled, and Flint noticed her teeth. Several seemed to have been recently filled with silver. "You think rather highly of yourself, don't you, Flint?" she said, without affection. "Airborne school, Special Forces school, graduation with top honors. Quite the prodigy, weren't you?" "Aren't we getting off the point?" "I don't think so. Because you blew it this time, warrant officer." She drew herself slowly upright, and Flint caught his breath. Lady J had always been tall, but she had never stood a full 2 inches above him as she did now. "Footloose trusted you." Flint's heart hammered in his chest. Her voice was becoming harsh, almost unrecognizable as that of Lady J. "And now he's lying dead, whereas you get to live to fight another day. Hardly seems fair, does it?" He began to back away. The figure before him was still that of Lady J, but her fluttering shadow was of a man, tall and threatening, who raised the silhouette of a rifle to shoulder height. "Why," said Lady J, with the voice of Destro, "you almost deserve to die." Flint launched himself bodily through the empty window frame of the farmhouse. Outside, the building was surrounded by a barbed wire fence, fully 4 meters tall. It had not been there before. Behind them, the figure of Destro was climbing unhurriedly out the window, the laser sight of the plasma phase rifle dancing across the grass toward him. Flint reached the fence in 2 strides and was rocked sickeningly backwards with a crackling of ozone. It was electrified. Only the insulation of boots and gloves had saved him from instant death. He tried to move, tried to crawl away from the looming phantasm of Destro, but there was no strength in his stricken limbs. The Winchester lay yards away beyond reach. "They say that old soldiers never die," gloated Destro, raising the rifle. "Let's test that theory, shall we?" The sound of the oscillograph was a shrieking tattoo in the room. Rigid, deathly pale, his foam-flecked lips drawn back in a soundless snarl, Flint looked close to death. Trent had seen the symptoms only once before on the field of combat. The hallucination was too deeply rooted. Flint was a man on the verge of a deep psychosis. "It seems you overestimated your charms, my dear," chuckled Destro, turning to Lady J. Lady J stood in crimson silence for a moment. Then she drove a sharp right hook into the underside of Destro's jaw, pinwheeling him across the room. Now, Flint's heart rate is 196 beats per minute. His blood pressure is 210/174. His respiration is 160 per minute, and it is 11:39 p.m. Blind berserker fury lent him strength. Still lying full length on the ground, Flint scissored his legs, tripping the unwary Destro, sending the plasma rifle spinning from his grasp. He seized the Winchester with both hands, pinning his opponent to the earth. "What's happening here?" he raged. "Who are you, Destro?" "Don't you know?" Destro spoke softly, voice curdled with loathing. "I am your shadow, Flint. I am a death in a handful of night terrors. You have always known me. I am Destro. What the hell are you talking about? I'm warning you, Destro. Unless I start getting some straight answers, You'll what? Kill me, perhaps? Destro laughed in his face. I wouldn't waste time in idle chit-chat if I were you, warrant officer. He motioned broadly to the horizon. Dawn was beginning to break, and for the first time Flint noticed that the landscape itself was beginning to move. Except it wasn't the landscape that was moving. As his eyes corrected for the dim sunrise, Flint cried out in revulsion and terror. A booming tidal wave of Cobra hardware, a military convoy the like of which he had never even imagined, was swarming over the horizon. Rattlers, hiss tanks, Stinger jeeps, ferrets, dreadnoughts, and in the sky, Fangs and Night Raven attack aircraft wheeled and rolled like prehistoric birds. They're coming for you, Flint, jeered Destro. They know you're here. How long do you think you'll last? With a savage animalistic roar, Flint hoisted Destro into the air, flinging him squarely into the electrified fence. The black-clad figure crackled and jerked, incredibly, still laughing as he wielded to the metal links in the coils of dark smoke. Eventually, he was still. For the rest of your life, Destro, said Flint mildly. His final grenade took out the fence in a cascade of lightning bolts. But as Flint sped out onto the darkened plain, it seemed that a voice pursued him, a withered, blasted voice, its laughter rustling and splintering like fire-blackened sticks. Run, Flint, it seemed to say. The 8th continent is mine. He ran, faster than ever before, in his life faster than he had ever been trained to run, faster, it seemed, than flesh and bone was capable of running. Something was happening to the landscape. Beneath him, the limp grass was withering and dying away. In its place, a formless gray substance that clung to the veined fronds to his pounding feet. Flint felt himself slowing, the primordial thunder of the Cobra strike force increasing in volume. Above him, the sky was changing too. Surely no earthly sunrise could spread such bloody cast across the heavens. Great black clouds crashed and churned together, and above the clamorous roar, Flint almost seemed to hear the rhythmic overture of some celestial orchestra. Take a spoonful of pleasant weather. Any June day will qualify. Flint floundered as the doughy, cloying earth roiled beneath him, pitching him into its sticky embrace. Stir the mixture up all together and make yourself a happiness pie. The Fangs and Night Ravens had reached him now, but as they circled in the inferno of the sky, they were no longer aircraft but enormous bats, a shadowed canopy of flying things. Remember 420 blackbirds one day were baked into a pie. Their ground vehicles were metamorphosizing in the dark, bestial shapes, the air rich with the thundering of hooves and the cawing of great birds. With an almighty effort, Flint dragged himself clear of the clinging ooze, forcing abominably taxed muscles into a staggering run. But just forget about the blackbirds with the bluebirds so close by. As he ran, Flint began to laugh. All semblance of reality was crumbling away, but the dreamscape was gradually lightening. The bloody skies washing clean as whatever had gripped him began to lose hold. I'm wise to you, Destro, he bellowed as he ran. I remember. Nembucane, the Morpheus program. This is all some kind of simulation. The breath died in Flint's throat as he mounted a hill. Destro was waiting for him. A Destro the size of a cliff, towering like a colossal cloud-capped silver idol or a colliding machine planet. Destro filled the horizon from east to west with the indisputable lord of all creation. Flint found his voice, a defiant pipsqueak chirp. I'm calling your bluff, Destro. I don't know how you got to Laszlo Norval or how deeply he's implicated, but it ends here. I'm waking up. A gauntleted hand the size of a blue whale reached out of the clouds, cyclones howling as lips moved behind a mountain range of silver. Have a filling of hugs and kisses, sang Destro as he crushed the life from Flint, when you make yourself a happiness pie. Now, Flint, his heart rate is 0 beats per minute, blood pressure is 0, respiration is 0, time is 00 a.m. So what is that, midnight? Flint suddenly arched violently off the Simcom couch, every muscle livid against his fever-wasted frame. Then he slumped completely still. As the oscillograph cut out, needles and indicators veering finally to 0. He's... began Trent, but could not finish the sentence. Calmly, Footloose motioned Lady J to stand aside. Then he emptied the entire clip of his Uzi into Destro. Lady J loosed one of the restraints, clasping a limp hand in her own as the three of them stood over Flint's couch, unable to speak. Unnoticed, the real Destro lay, unmoving, in the corner of the room, reflected in the still lustrous sheen of his cracked silver mask. The flare of burning circuitry went equally unnoticed. The Morpheus device erupted in a starburst of superheated explosive. It consumed the room in a microsecond, incinerating all furniture and equipment, vaporizing the occupants. It surged through the corridors of the Action Force headquarters, consuming all in its path until, in still less than a second, it reached the armory and fuel dumps. When the morning editions rolled off the press, the headlines would read, "Fire Down Below," and would blame the blackened, smoldering crater, the horrific death toll, on the collision of two underground trains. None escaped to tell the true story, that Action Force was already dead and cremated, the bowels of London, its burial urn. What? Now, Flint is at 45 beats per minute. His blood pressure is 120/70. His respiration is 40 per minute. The time is 8:42 p.m. It's time to move. 20 minutes rest of the parachute drop. With daylight fading, Warrant Officer Flint and infantry trooper Footloose of Action Force faced off against the massed hordes of Cobra. Flint was unhappy. Eels! What in hell's name is a platoon of Cobra Sea troopers doing way out? Delete. In the strategy room of a bleak castle high in the Balkans, Destro sat calmly before an opulent ebony and alabaster chessboard, a crushed pawn in his fist. The pawn wore the minutely enameled uniform of an Action Force warrant officer. Watching the frozen images of two soldiers on the screen of a giant battle computer, Destro did not look up as a cowled uniformed figure clacked across the flagstones toward him. "How much longer, Destro? How often are you going to run the same program before you admit failure?" "Patience is a virtue you do well to cultivate, Cobra Commander. The good tactician does not admit defeat. He sculpts and reshapes it into success. My probability grid is a means to that end." "Dream on, Destro. Whatever fanciful visions you may sculpt in that outsized video game of yours, the outcome of the game cannot alter unless the players themselves are changed. And you cannot destroy Action Force without also destroying yourself." "What would you have me do? Laszlo Norval would never agree to aid us." Cobra Commander spun on his heel, manic light dawning in his eyes. "Not willingly, perhaps." "The point, Cobra Commander?" The Cobra leader paced, striking a fist against his gloved palm. "Norval's innovation, the drug which renders sleeping subjects suggestible to outside stimuli, Nembucane?" Destro straightened up in the silver throne, suddenly alert. "The very same. Might we not obtain similar results with a conscious subject?" He made for the door. "Run that through your probability grid, Destro." Destro sat silent and contemplated for a long moment, listening to the ebb of Cobra Commander's footsteps on the stone flags. Then he reached for the intercom, paging servants' quarters. "Prepare for a banquet," said Destro, "and please ensure that Dr. Laszlo Norval is on the guest list." Then he began to reorganize his chessboard, humming an obscure piece of 1930s dance music as he did so. And that's it for Night Moves. Night Fighting, Part 2. I can't say it was rewarding, because I guess apparently the whole thing was a simulation done by Destro, so it was all a dream. And I'm sure my impeccable voice acting didn't help any of the confusion either, trying to track what was going on. You assume that the one level of reality is really happening, and then that gets pulled out from you. But I gotta tell you, the idea of everyone dying in that fire, that was exciting. I was like, oh wow, they're really doing an Action Force. And then it's all just a dream within Destro's computer. So who knows? And I don't know what this deal with Laszlo Norval. I should hold on. Let me Google him real quick. Well, if they ended up using Laszlo Norval in other places, I couldn't find it real quick. So that's it for Action Force Annual. I hope everyone enjoyed that. There's a few more annuals I think we'll cover. I don't know if we'll get to them next week. I gotta figure that out. But thanks again for joining us this week on Joe on Joe. I appreciate each and every one of you. You are the best. And now you Joe. And Joeing is half the battle.